Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. Let's get rolling. I wanted to discuss in this episode the concept of the labor aristocracy factor. I tried to figure out a way of explaining it in a way that would make sense to the average person. Somebody, for example, who was not familiar with Maoism, Third Worldism. Now, bear in mind, I'm only expressing my own views, and maybe even in that, I feel sometimes I really don't have a right to do that, because compared with most people, my knowledge of Maoism, Third Worldism is kind of scant, to say the least. This is my second time as a Maoist Third Worldist, and this time around, I've only been Maoist Third Worldist for 13 months, not very long. But nevertheless, I have this podcast and I need to do something with it, or else why have it? Well, I guess I could stop talking, but that's not really an option for me. So here, I will lay out what I think is a very good way, in my opinion, of understanding the concept of labor aristocracy. And this, again, is only my own personal viewpoint. Now, why am I making this? I came across an article on Reddit which tried to argue that Maoist Third Worldists are not really revolutionaries, that in fact we are counter-revolutionaries. Why? Well, because Maoist Third Worldists believe that it is most likely that revolutions will start in the third and possibly the fourth world. That does not mean that they can't start in the first world. It just means that based upon empirical observation, when you look at the first world, you simply don't see a huge amount of dialectical or revolutionary contradictions. So the chances of any massive, tremendously large, or even small revolutions occurring here in the United States of America is honestly inconceivable to me. Now, if you are a first worldist and you believe something differently than that, please respond to this video. Tell me why. Tell me what your evidence is that the first world has dialectical potential or sufficient dialectical potential to stage revolutions leading to revolutionary socialism or communism. I dare you. Well, no, I'm just playing games, but you're welcome to do that, and I will respond to what you have to say. I am always willing and even enthusiastic to discuss things with people. In case you haven't noticed, I have the gift of gab. I would imagine that is either a quality or a fault that most podcasters have, which I suppose is what draws us into this, for me, line of non-work, because I'm not being paid for it, and I won't accept any money from anybody. So again, I think that there is a way of understanding the concept of why there is not a likelihood of revolution in the first world now by turning to what I refer to, and this is my own term, as the labor aristocracy factor. In other words, I am not creating labor aristocracy as a social class. I am placing the labor aristocracy among those who are not class conscious, who basically have virtually no dialectical potential. What is labor aristocracy? Basically, It is the idea that there are some proletarians, some workers here in the first world who benefit from the exploitation of people in the third and fourth worlds. Now, I think that is indisputable. There are a lot of people who do that. People who work in factory production. I mean, what basically happened in the 1980s in the United States, primarily through the instrumentality of Ronald Reagan, is he moved most production jobs offshore. By offshore, I mean to Latin America. Why? Because Reagan was not only an anti-communist, he was beyond that. He was a rabid anti-communist. He was terrified of communism. I know somebody like that, or knew. He was really afraid that communism would spread from Nicaragua, which is kind of odd since Nicaragua was not really a communist or revolutionary socialist country, to the rest of Latin America. And he used Cuba as an example. Well, Cuba, yeah. Cuba is or was maybe a revolutionary socialist or communist country, sure, okay. But he really provided no evidence for that. But based upon his fear that communism was going to spread, it would spread. How horrible that eventually the entire continent of South America, and maybe Central America too, and maybe even Mexico, would be taken over by communists. However hard to believe that is apparently what Ronald Reagan really did accept. That was his heartfelt conviction. I don't mean to belittle him for it. I remember the Reagan presidency vividly. I despised Reagan. We used to call him by a rather, by a variety of rather disparaging nicknames. One of them that I personally liked was Ronnie Reagan, because of Ronald Reagan's support of the program that wanted to put weapons in outer space, the Stargate program, or whatever it was called. He supported that. And so Ronnie Reagan seemed like an appropriate name for Ronald Reagan. Again, I was no fan of his. I was no fan of his comrade in arms, Margaret Thatcher, in the UK either. It seemed to me like they were basically reading from the same script, and maybe they were. I know they had meetings together. Maybe they decided on what they would say or how they would say it. But both of them were very, very strong anti-communists. And so to them, moving American industrial production into Latin America was the first step to fighting communism, whatever communism was imagined to be, in Latin America. Now, aside from the fact that there really was no communism, at least in South America, at least in Central America, at least in Mexico, I'm leaving out Cuba because, yeah, Cuba was a communist country. Whether it is now, I think, is debatable. But certainly back then, it could be considered that. And that really, really bothered Reagan. Not only Reagan, it bothered many presidents before him and after him. And multiple times, the CIA has admitted it attempted to kill Fidel Castro. Horrendous acts that were imagined by the United States of America the country into which I was born and raised, not something for which I am proud. As I've said before, I commonly will apologize to people when introducing myself as an American citizen, because I feel that is the only ethical and moral thing to do. So, a lot of Americans, in the wake of that transplantation of American jobs into Latin America, benefited. Do you remember the song, or maybe you only heard the song after it was played decades later by Billy Joel? We're living here in Allentown, and they're tearing all the factories down. That was a testimony to what was happening in what became known as the Rust Belt of the United States, because companies, even companies that want to stay in the United States, could not do so because they couldn't compete. Say all of your competition went to South America, but you said, no, I want to stay here. Well, what would that mean? That would mean that you would end up paying higher manufacturing costs, whereas people in Latin America would be paying a very small portion of the costs that you were paying. And so, in effect, you would be driving yourself out of business. So companies were forced by circumstance, really, to move down to Latin America, even if they did not really want to. And many proletarians right here in the first world benefited from that. They made money because the kinds of jobs that they did not want to do, basically jobs like, I don't know, jobs that basically demanded a very little amount of brain power, were now out of the country. And now you were free to pursue, I guess, better jobs, whatever better is. So you literally benefited in more ways than one from what Ronald Reagan did back in the 1980s. In a way, you can argue that Ronald Reagan created the labor aristocracy. Now, that is only partially true because you can find precedents for it before Reagan. But I think for the most part, that statement is accurate, connecting Reagan directly with the rise of the labor aristocracy right here in the US. What has that done? That has resulted in a tremendous amount of false consciousness in the United States. It is one of the reasons, but not the only one, why there is virtually no dialectical or revolutionary potential here in the US. I mean, how can there be? How can there be? The proletariat was drained. It was drained. It was drained by the labor aristocracy, which literally took people out of the proletariat. The labor aristocracy factor. I think it is perhaps the most important consideration when examining late stage capitalism right here in the United States. It is something that I remember vividly, and it is not something that I am proud of or am happy about, because I know many people who were victimized by it, lost jobs, who basically had nowhere else to go. They were not in the labor aristocracy, but as a result of what happened, of what Reagan did, they were forced from the working class into the working poor. If that, if not the underclass, or what I prefer to call the subaltern. They were really, really brought down to a level that might have been inconceivable before Reagan made that horrendous misstep in his presidency. And Reagan never apologized for it. Not once. Not once. He never apologized for what he did. Admittedly, he was getting dementia at that time. It got to the point after his presidency was completed that he did not even recognize his own wife, Nancy. And I am not happy about that. I am sorry for him as a human being. I'm sad that that happened to Ronald Reagan. I am not a person who was a sadist. I don't relish in the sufferings of others. I would like everyone to prosper, to experience what critical realist Roy Bhaskar commonly referred to as eudaimonia, the good life, the good life. I would like to see everyone leading the good life, but alas, that is not what we see right now in the US. And that is primarily, again, because of this labor aristocracy factor, which bleeded the proletariat, the working class, of a large percentage of its members, brought them down into the working poor or the subaltern. It destroyed them. Supposedly, they were supposed to be retrained. How many times did that happen? I'll give you a guess. Almost never. Almost never. These people were not retrained. They suffered. And they suffered because of the inexcusable, in my opinion, decisions that were made by Ronald Reagan in his quest to fight his imaginary communism in South America, a communism which never even existed. And so, what I hope this episode has done is to show you how I, as a Maoist third worldist, though I certainly do not claim by any stroke of the imagination to be representative of other Maoist third worldists, but I, as a Maoist third worldist, look at the concept of the proletariat. Is there a proletariat in the first world? Yes, there is, but it is very, very small. And that is because of the labor aristocracy factor, which has bled the proletariat dry. It has stolen the most precious resources, the human resources, which power the economy, and move them down to Latin America. Now, I am not opposed to moving resources to other parts of the world. I support the rights of other countries, especially third world countries, certainly more than I support the rights of my own country. But I still feel bad about the way in which it was done. In other words, the third world could have been helped without bleeding the U.S. dry. How? Through cooperative arrangements. There was no attempt by Reagan to enter into any cooperative arrangements with Latin America. Why? Because he saw them as the enemy, or at least the potential enemy. He was terrified of them. I mean, Reagan was basically a resurrection of Joseph McCarthy, in a sense. His MO was different than McCarthy's, but his objective was the same, to crush communism. Now, McCarthy was trying to crush his imaginary communism here in the US. Reagan was trying to crush his own imaginary communism in Latin America. But in the end, they both failed. They both failed because neither one of them had a grasp of the world situation. Neither one of them understood the body politique. And as a result, the United States has suffered, and Latin America has continued to suffer as well. And so that is the way I reconcile those things. No, I do not reject the idea that there is a proletariat here in the US or in the first world at large. But I would argue again that it is tiny. And the primary reason for that is Ronald Reagan, who was the main person who gave fuel to the labor aristocracy, where American workers began supporting people in the third world, but not for the right reason, supporting them because it benefited themselves. It benefited them as first worlders, not because it benefited people in the third world. That was not their concern. That was never their concern. Their concern was purely egocentric, purely self-centered. Nothing wrong with being egocentric if it's done for the right reasons. I'm an academic. Academics are generally egocentric, meaning we have certain ideas, certain projects that we pursue, certain research that we do, certain things that we write, certain courses that we like to teach, certain committees that we want to serve on. If we treat that egocentricity as an act of service, it is good. But if we treat it as an act of self-aggrandizement, it is not good at all. And sadly, that has been the plight of the labor aristocracy factor in the US, where you have workers treating the way that they have benefited from the exploitation of the third world as a benefit to themselves, and doing nothing to attempt to remedy that situation. Will that situation be remedied? I don't know. Again, I'm not a prophet, but I don't think it will be remedied under the capitalist world system. We need to wait for that system to come crashing down, and crashing down it must. And once it crashes down, because it is crashing down, that we know, then hopefully the workers in the third world and the fourth world will rise up, start their own revolutions for revolutionary socialism or communism, and bring about a transformation in their parts of the world, which, if we are lucky, or I should say, if I am lucky here in the first world, although I imagine I will be long gone by then, it may eventually come to the first world too. But would I count on that? No. I would not count on that. For the time being, this has been Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Metarealism. Have a pleasant evening and an even better day tomorrow.